The phone rang at exactly 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in October, cutting through the silence of Ophelia Chen's cramped studio apartment like a blade through silk. She'd been awake anyway, staring at the water stain on her ceiling that resembled a map of somewhere she'd never been, nursing her third cup of lukewarm coffee and trying to make sense of the credit card statement that had arrived yesterday. $7,000 charged to venues she'd never heard of, florists whose names sounded like fairy tales, and a bridal boutique in Manhattan that cost more than her annual rent. Hello? Her voice cracked with exhaustion and something deeper, a bone-tired weariness that came from 6 months of fighting ghosts. Ms. Chen? Ms. Ophelia Chen? The voice on the other end was crisp, authoritative, with the kind of measured cadence that suggested important decisions were made daily. Yes, this is Ophelia. She sat up straighter on her second-hand couch, pushing aside the manila folders stuffed with police reports, credit bureau disputes, and lawyer consultations that had become the landscape of her life. This is Justice Patricia Morrison from the United States Supreme Court. I apologize for calling at this unusual hour, but I've been made aware of a situation involving your identity that requires immediate clarification. Ophelia's coffee mug slipped from her fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor in a spray of ceramic and cold caffeine. The Supreme Court. The actual Supreme Court was calling her at nearly 4 a.m. about her sister's elaborate wedding fraud. She stared at her reflection in the black window, seeing a woman she barely recognized, hollow-cheeked, dark circles under eyes that used to sparkle with ambition, wearing the same gray sweater she'd pulled on 3 days ago. I'm sorry, did you say the Supreme Court? Yes, Ms. Chen. It has come to our attention that someone using your Social Security number and identification has been selected as a law clerk for Justice Williams' chambers beginning this term. However, our background investigation has revealed some discrepancies. The woman who interviewed for this position last spring appears to have provided fraudulent credentials. We need to determine if you are complicit in this deception or if you are in fact a victim of identity theft. The room began to spin. Ophelia pressed her back against the couch cushions, trying to anchor herself to something solid. Her sister Vivian had not only stolen her identity to fund a lavish wedding, she had somehow used it to land one of the most prestigious legal positions in the country. The position Ophelia had dreamed of since she was 12 years old, sitting in her father's study, reading about landmark cases by flashlight after bedtime. Justice Morrison, I had no idea. I never applied for any Supreme Court position. I've been dealing with identity theft for months, but I thought it was just about the wedding expenses. My sister, Ophelia's voice caught. Even now, after everything, the betrayal felt fresh, like a wound that refused to heal. Your sister? Vivian Chen. She's my twin sister. She took out credit cards in my name, used my Social Security number, even somehow got a duplicate driver's license. I've been reporting it to the police, to the credit bureaus, but no one would listen. They kept saying it was a family matter, a civil dispute. But this is federal, isn't it? Justice Morrison's silence stretched long enough for Ophelia to hear her own heartbeat. Outside her window, the first pale light of dawn was beginning to creep across the Brooklyn skyline, painting the buildings in shades of gray and gold. Somewhere in this city, Vivian was probably sleeping peacefully next to her new husband Marcus, surrounded by wedding gifts purchased with Ophelia's stolen credit, living a life built on lies.
Yes, of course. Ophelia scrambled for a pen, knocking over a stack of legal documents. But Justice Morrison, I need you to understand. I never graduated from law school. I mean, I started at Columbia, but I had to drop out in my second year because of my father's medical bills. Vivian graduated from Fordham last year, but she used my transcripts somehow. My LSAT scores, my undergraduate records from Yale. I don't know how she managed it, but Ms. Chen, Justice Morrison's voice was gentle but firm. Based on our investigation, the transcripts and test scores used in the application process were legitimate. They belong to you. Your sister appears to have assumed your identity not just for financial gain, but to claim your academic achievements as her own. The weight of those words settled over Ophelia like a shroud. Her academic achievements. The 4.0 GPA at Yale that she'd earned while working 2 jobs and sending money home for her mother's cancer treatments. The LSAT score that had placed her in the 99th percentile, taking during the worst period of her life when her father was dying of complications from diabetes. The law school grades that had made her professors take notice, earned despite the fact that she was sleeping 4 hours a night and living on ramen noodles to afford textbooks. All of it stolen, all of it claimed by Vivian, who had spent their childhood being the prettier twin, the more charming twin, the one their parents praised for her social skills, while Ophelia buried herself in books. Vivian, who had sailed through Fordham with mediocre grades and no particular ambition beyond marrying well and living comfortably. Vivian, who had somehow convinced their parents that Ophelia's withdrawal from law school was due to laziness rather than sacrifice. "There's something else, Ms. Chen," Justice Morrison continued. "The law clerk position, it comes with a substantial signing bonus and first-year salary. Nearly $80,000 was deposited into an account under your name 6 weeks ago. Money that, I suspect, helped fund this wedding you mentioned." Ophelia closed her eyes, seeing the Instagram posts that had tortured her for the past month. Vivian in a custom Vera Wen gown that cost more than Ophelia's annual salary at the nonprofit where she had been working as a paralegal. The reception at the Plaza Hotel with centerpieces that looked like cascading waterfalls of white orchids. The honeymoon in Tuscany, documented in carefully curated photos that showed her sister laughing in vineyards and kissing Marcus against sunset backdrops. All of it paid for with money earned by Ophelia's achievements, stolen through Ophelia's identity, celebrated by family members who had barely spoken to Ophelia since she gave up on her dreams. "I'll catch the next train to D.C., Ophelia said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Justice Morrison, what happens now? To Vivian, I mean, and to the position?" "That, Ms. Chen, depends on several factors, but I will say this. The Supreme Court takes fraud very seriously, and if you are indeed the rightful owner of the credentials used to secure this position, well, we may have found ourselves in the unusual situation of hiring the right person through entirely wrong means." After Justice Morrison hung up, Ophelia sat in the growing morning light, surrounded by the debris of her shattered coffee cup and the scattered papers of her ruined credit. For 6 months, she had felt like she was drowning, pulled under by Vivian's lies while everyone around her, family, friends, authorities, told her it was her own fault for not protecting her information better, for trusting too much, for being naive about family loyalty. But now, someone with real power was listening. Someone who understood that identity theft wasn't just about money. It was about the theft of dreams, achievements, and futures. It was about one person consuming another's entire existence, leaving nothing but empty shells and broken credit scores behind. Ophelia stood up carefully, her legs shaky with adrenaline and possibility. She needed to shower, pack, call in sick to work, and figure out how to explain to her boss that she might not be coming back, ever. Because Justice Morrison's call hadn't just woken her from sleep, it had woken her from the nightmare of the past 6 months, the feeling that she was invisible, that her pain didn't matter, that justice was something that happened to other people. As she stepped over the broken ceramic, she caught sight of herself in the bathroom mirror. The woman looking back at her wasn't the polished law student she'd once been, or the
confident Yale graduate who had believed the world was full of possibilities. But she wasn't the broken victim she'd been yesterday either. She was someone in between, scarred but standing, tired but determined, ready to reclaim not just her identity, but her entire stolen life. The train to Washington would leave in 3 hours. For the first time in 6 months, Ophelia Chen was going somewhere that mattered, armed with something more powerful than police reports or credit disputes. She was going with the truth, and finally, someone with the authority to act on it was waiting to hear what she had to say. The Amtrak train from Penn Station to Union Station in Washington, D.C. took 3.5 hours, but for Ophelia, it felt like traveling through time itself. She pressed her face against the window, watching the familiar landscape of the Northeast Corridor blur past, the industrial outskirts of New York giving way to the suburban sprawl of New Jersey, then Philadelphia's skyline, Baltimore's harbor, and finally the approach to the nation's capital. Each mile carried her further from the small, suffocating world her life had become and closer to something she couldn't quite name yet. Vindication, perhaps, or simply acknowledgement that she existed, that her achievements were real, that her pain mattered. She'd packed everything important into a single rolling suitcase and her father's old leather messenger bag, the one he'd carried to his job at the post office for 37 years before diabetes took his eyesight, then his mobility, then his life. Inside the bag were photocopies of every document she'd filed in the past 6 months. Police reports that had been marked civil matter and filed away. Credit bureau disputes that resulted in form letters explaining that family disputes didn't qualify for fraud protection. Emails from lawyers who quoted fees she couldn't afford for cases they weren't sure they could win. But there were other documents too. One she'd almost forgotten she still had. Her Yale transcript, pristine and official, showing a GPA that had earned her magna cum laude honors. Her LSAT score report, the numbers that had once felt like a golden ticket to the future she'd planned. Letters of recommendation from professors who believed in her potential, written in language so glowing it made her chest ache to remember the woman she had been when she earned those words. That woman felt like a stranger now. The Ophelia who had walked across Yale's campus in cap and gown, summa cum laude in political science with a minor in philosophy, had been certain that hard work and merit would carry her anywhere she wanted to go. She had planned her future with the precision of an architect. 2 years at Columbia Law, summer internships that would build her resume, then a clerkship with a federal judge, maybe even the Supreme Court if she was extraordinarily fortunate. After that, perhaps the Department of Justice, or a top-tier firm where she could save enough money to eventually do public interest work without worrying about her family's medical bills. But instead, at the end of her first year at Columbia, her father's diabetes took a devastating turn. The complications came quickly. First, his vision, requiring expensive treatments and adaptive equipment, then neuropathy in his hands and feet, making his postal route impossible to complete. The medical bills arrived like an avalanche, each one larger than the last, while his disability benefits were tied up in bureaucratic delays that stretched for months. Ophelia made the calculation quickly, without drama or self-pity. Her parents had sacrificed everything to give her and Vivian opportunities they'd never had. Her mother worked double shifts at the hospital laundry to help pay for their education, coming home at midnight with hands cracked from industrial detergents and feet swollen from standing on concrete floors. Her father had driven mail trucks through blizzards and heat waves, never missing a day of work in 2 decades, proud of the steady paycheck that kept their small family afloat. When the bills came, there had been no choice. Ophelia withdrew from Columbia, took a job as a paralegal in a small firm in Queens, and moved back home to help care for her father. She told herself it was temporary, that she would reapply to law school once the financial crisis passed, but her father's condition only worsened, requiring round-the-clock care that insurance didn't fully cover. By the time he died 18 months later, Ophelia's law school dreams felt like luxuries she could no longer afford.
Vivian, meanwhile, had continued at Fordham as if nothing had changed. She visited home occasionally, bringing flowers and sympathy, but never offering to help with bills or caregiving responsibilities. After their father's funeral, she had hugged Ophelia tightly and whispered, "You're so much stronger than me. I could never have done what you did." At the time, Ophelia had felt grateful for the recognition, proud that her sacrifice had protected Vivian's future. She hadn't realized that Vivian was already planning to steal that future for herself.
The first sign of trouble had come 8 months ago, when Ophelia received a credit card statement for an account she'd never opened. The charges were small at first: dinner at expensive restaurants, shopping trips to boutiques she couldn't afford even if she'd wanted to visit them. When she called the credit card company, they informed her that the account had been opened with her social security number and a copy of her driver's license. The woman on the phone suggested she file a police report for identity theft. But when Ophelia mentioned that she suspected her sister, the tone changed immediately. "Family members have access to each other's information," the representative had said, her voice taking on the weary tone of someone who'd handled these calls before. "This sounds like a civil matter. You might want to have a conversation with your sister about unauthorized use." But when Ophelia confronted Vivian, her sister had been genuinely confused, even hurt by the accusation. She'd hugged Ophelia and promised to look into whether someone might have accessed her personal information during her recent move to Manhattan with Marcus. She'd been so convincing, so sincere in her concern, that Ophelia had felt guilty for suspecting her own twin sister. The charges continued, growing larger and more frequent: a custom wedding dress, catering deposits, venue bookings, photography packages. When Ophelia found herself unable to rent an apartment because her credit score had plummeted, she'd gone to the police with a folder full of evidence. The desk sergeant had barely looked at the papers before shaking his head. 90% of identity theft cases involve family members, he'd said, his tone suggesting this was common knowledge she should have already possessed. And 90% of those cases, the victim knows exactly who's doing it. You need to handle this as a family matter, not a criminal one. Unless you're willing to press charges against your sister and see her arrested, there's nothing we can do. The idea of having Vivian arrested had seemed impossible then. Despite everything, Ophelia still thought of her sister as the girl who used to sneak into her bed during thunderstorms, who shared secrets and dreams, and the particular closeness that comes from sharing a womb for 9 months. When their parents asked why Ophelia looked so tired, so stressed, Vivian would squeeze her hand and change the subject, protecting them both from an uncomfortable conversation. But as the wedding approached, the theft had escalated beyond anything Ophelia could have imagined. Not just credit cards now, but bank loans in her name, a car lease for a BMW that Vivian drove to her engagement party, jewelry purchases that showed up on her credit report like accusations. By the time she realized the full scope of what was happening, Vivian was already walking down the aisle in a dress worth more than Ophelia earned in 6 months. The wedding itself had been torture. Ophelia had stood in the back of the church wearing a dress she'd bought at a thrift store because it was all she could afford, watching her sister promise to love and honor Marcus while surrounded by flowers paid for with Ophelia's stolen credit. Their parents wept with joy, praising Vivian's success, her beautiful wedding, her bright future. Relatives who had always favored Vivian whispered about how proud the family should be, how well she had done for herself. No one asked Ophelia how she was managing to afford the gift she'd brought, or why she looked so thin, or why she left immediately after the ceremony without staying for the reception. They were too busy celebrating Vivian's achievement to notice Ophelia's absence. But the Supreme Court clerkship, that was different. That wasn't just theft, it was the erasure of Ophelia's entire academic identity, the claiming of achievements that represented years of sacrifice and dedication. When Justice Morrison had described the application materials, Ophelia had recognized her own words in the personal statement, her own experiences in the essays about overcoming adversity.
Vivian had taken not just her financial information, but her memories, her struggles, her triumphs, and repackaged them as her own story. As the train pulled into Union Station, Ophelia felt something she hadn't experienced in months, a sense of purpose. For 6 months, she had been reactive, defensive, scrambling to prove that she was a victim of crimes that everyone around her insisted were family disputes. But now she was traveling towards something active, something that acknowledged not just that she had been wronged, but that her achievements had value, that her dreams mattered, that justice might actually be possible. The Supreme Court building was only a few miles away, but it felt like the distance between the life she'd been forced to accept and the life she'd been meant to live. For the first time since her father's funeral, Ophelia Chen was traveling toward her dreams instead of away from them. The Supreme Court building rose before Ophelia like a temple from another world, its marble columns and bronze doors speaking of permanence and authority that made her small problems feel simultaneously insignificant and monumentally important. She climbed the steps slowly, each footfall echoing against stone that had witnessed decades of constitutional crises, landmark decisions, and the quiet daily work of justice. The building seemed to hum with the weight of history, and Ophelia found herself thinking about all the people who had climbed these same steps, seeking vindication, recognition, or simply the acknowledgement that their grievances mattered enough for the highest court in the land to consider. Justice Patricia Morrison's office was located in the section of the building reserved for the justices' chambers, a maze of mahogany-paneled corridors lined with portraits of legal luminaries and glass cases displaying historical documents. Ophelia was escorted by a serious young man in a navy suit who introduced himself as David Park, a law clerk for Justice Morrison. As they walked, he explained that Justice Morrison had taken a personal interest in her case after discovering irregularities in the background check process for Justice Williams' new law clerk. The person who interviewed for the position was impressive, David said, as they paused outside a door marked with Justice Morrison's nameplate. Articulate, knowledgeable about constitutional law, with an academic record that was genuinely exceptional. But something didn't add up. The woman in the interview didn't seem to have the depth of experience that her transcripts suggested she should have. Small things, but Justice Morrison has been doing this for 15 years. She notices discrepancies. Inside the office, Justice Morrison was seated behind a desk that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of mahogany, its surface covered with neat stacks of briefs, legal opinions, and what appeared to be background investigation files. She stood when Ophelia entered, extending her hand with the same measured authority that had characterized her phone call. Patricia Morrison was smaller than Ophelia had expected, probably in her early 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a simple chignon and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She wore a navy suit that looked expensive but not ostentatious, and when she smiled, Ophelia saw genuine warmth beneath the judicial formality. "Miss Chen, thank you for coming so quickly. Please sit down. I know this situation must be incredibly overwhelming, but I want you to understand that we take identity theft very seriously here, particularly when it involves positions of public trust." Justice Morrison gestured to a chair across from her desk, then settled back into her own seat with the careful attention of someone accustomed to weighing evidence. "David has prepared a timeline of events based on our investigation," she continued, sliding a folder across the desk. "I'd like you to review this and tell us where our information differs from your recollection." The folder contained photocopies of documents that made Ophelia's breath catch in her throat. Her Yale transcript, but submitted as part of an application she'd never completed. Her LSAT scores attached to a personal statement she recognized as her own words, but rewritten in Vivian's slightly more dramatic style. Letters of recommendation from her undergraduate professors forwarded to the Supreme Court by someone claiming to be her. But the personal statement made her hands shake. The essay described growing up as the daughter of immigrants. Their parents had actually been born in California, but their grandparents had immigrated from Taiwan in the 1960s. It talked about the sacrifice of leaving law school to care for an aging parent, the financial struggles that made pursuing dreams seem impossible, the determination to serve justice despite setbacks. Every word was true, but they were Ophelia's truths, Ophelia's struggles, repackaged as Vivian's inspiring journey of overcoming adversity. She changed small details, Ophelia said, her voice barely above a whisper, made it sound like she was the one who dropped out of law school, like she was the one who sacrificed her career for family. But she wasn't. Vivian stayed in school. She graduated on time while I was working 60-hour weeks to pay for our father's medical care.
Justice Morrison leaned forward slightly. Can you prove that you were the one who left Columbia Law School? Yes. Ophelia opened her father's messenger bag and pulled out a folder she'd prepared during the train ride. Here's my Columbia withdrawal form, dated February 15, 2022. Here's my final transcript, showing a 3.7 GPA through the fall semester of my first year. Here's the letter I wrote to the dean, explaining that I was leaving for family financial reasons. She spread the documents across Justice Morrison's desk like evidence in a trial, which she supposed it was. And here's Vivian's Fordham transcript showing she graduated in May 2023, right on schedule. She never left law school. She never sacrificed anything. David Park had been taking notes in a leather-bound journal, and now he looked up with a frown. Ms. Chen, how did your sister obtain these documents? Your Yale transcript, your LSAT scores, your personal academic records? Ophelia had been dreading this question because the answer revealed the depth of her own naivety, her willingness to trust family in ways that had made the theft possible. When I moved back home to help with my father's care, I left some of my papers in Vivian's apartment. She was living in Manhattan then, in a place Marcus helped her rent, and I thought it would be safer to keep important documents there than in our parents' house, where— She paused, embarrassed by the memory. My father sometimes got confused because of his medications. I was afraid he might accidentally throw away something important. So your sister had access to your academic records for over a year. Yes, and she knew my social security number, obviously, we're twins. She'd seen me fill out applications, knew my passwords for most things. When we were younger, we used to help each other with paperwork all the time. I never thought— Ophelia's voice trailed off as she realized how foolish it sounded, how thoroughly she had enabled her own victimization. Justice Morrison's expression remained neutral, but not unkind. Ms. Chen, in my experience, family fraud is often the most devastating precisely because it requires such a profound betrayal of trust. The victims aren't naive. They're simply functioning within normal family relationships where sharing personal information is common and expected. She opened another file on her desk. What concerns me most about this case is the sophistication involved. Your sister didn't just steal your identity to make purchases. She created an entirely false narrative about her own academic and professional background, then used that narrative to secure a position that requires the highest level of security clearance. This isn't shoplifting or check fraud. This is the systematic theft of another person's achievements and credentials. What happens now? To Vivian, I mean, and to the clerkship. Justice Morrison exchanged a glance with David Park before answering. Your sister has been working in Justice Williams' chambers for 6 weeks now. She's been handling sensitive legal matters, accessing confidential case files, participating in discussions about cases that could affect millions of Americans. The security implications alone are staggering. But more importantly, David added, she's been doing good work. Justice Williams speaks highly of her legal reasoning, her written analysis, her dedication to the job, which raises an interesting question about whether the fraud was motivated by financial gain or by something more complex. Ophelia stared at him. What do you mean? Your sister attended Fordham Law School, which is a perfectly respectable institution. She could have applied for clerkships using her own credentials, her own achievements, but instead she chose to steal yours, even though it required elaborate deception and significant legal risk. Why?
The question hung in the air like an accusation, and Ophelia found herself thinking about their childhood, the ways their parents had responded to their different strengths and personalities. Vivian had always been the social one, the one who made friends easily and charmed adults.
With her quick wit and easy smile. But Ophelia had been the academic achiever, the one their parents bragged about to relatives, the one teachers remembered years later. "She wanted my life," Ophelia said slowly. "Not just my credit or my money. She wanted to be the smart one, the accomplished one. She wanted people to look at her the way they used to look at me." "But she is accomplished," Justice Morrison said gently. "Her work here has been exceptional, even if it was obtained fraudulently, which suggests that this wasn't about capability. It was about recognition, about being seen as the sister who succeeded rather than the sister who merely did well enough." The complexity of it made Ophelia's head spin. Vivian was smart enough to excel in a Supreme Court clerkship, talented enough to impress Justice Williams, capable enough to handle the most challenging legal work in the country. But instead of pursuing those achievements honestly, using her own credentials and abilities, she had chosen to steal Ophelia's identity and wear it like a costume, performing success in someone else's stolen accomplishments. "The wedding," Ophelia said suddenly. "It wasn't just about having a beautiful wedding. It was about proving that she could have the life I was supposed to have. The prestigious job, the perfect husband, the fairy tale wedding, all funded by achievements that were supposed to be mine." Justice Morrison nodded slowly. "Which brings us to the question of what happens next. We have clear evidence of fraud, document forgery, and identity theft. These are federal crimes when they involve positions in the federal government. Your sister could face serious criminal charges. But we also have a practical problem," David continued. "Justice Williams needs a law clerk, and the clerk he has, regardless of how she obtained the position, is apparently quite good at the job. Meanwhile, the person who legitimately earned those credentials, you, hasn't completed law school and technically isn't qualified for the position, even though your achievements are what got it." Ophelia felt the room tilting around her, the weight of possibilities and complications settling over her like a heavy blanket. For 6 months, she had wanted nothing more than to have someone acknowledge that she was the victim of a crime, that her pain was real, that justice was possible. Now, she was sitting in the Supreme Court, talking to a justice who clearly believed her and was prepared to act on that belief. But instead of feeling vindicated, she felt lost in the maze of what justice might actually look like. "Justice Morrison," she said carefully, "what do you think I should do?" The justice smiled for the first time since Ophelia had entered the office, and it transformed her entire face, revealing the warmth that existed beneath the judicial authority. "Miss Chen, I think you should finish law school, and I think your sister should face the consequences of her choices. And I think the Supreme Court should figure out how to handle the fact that we accidentally hired the right person through entirely wrong means. But in the meantime," she continued, "I think you should meet Justice Williams and see what he thinks about this situation. Because if there's one thing I've learned in 15 years on this court, it's that sometimes the most complicated problems require the most creative solutions." Justice Robert Williams' chambers occupied a corner of the Supreme Court building that had been designed to inspire contemplation and careful thought. Tall windows overlooked the Capitol building, their heavy drapes pulled back to let in the soft afternoon light that painted everything in shades of gold and amber. The walls were lined with law books that looked well-used rather than decorative, their spines cracked and softened by decades of consultation. A portrait of Thurgood Marshall hung above the fireplace, watching over the room with the quiet dignity of someone who understood that justice was not just about law, but about human dignity and the courage to do what was right, even when it was difficult. Justice Williams himself was younger than Ophelia had expected, probably in his early 50s, with graying temples and the kind of focused intensity that suggested a mind constantly at work. He stood when Justice Morrison brought Ophelia into his office, extending his hand with a firm grip and a smile that seemed genuinely warm, despite the gravity of the situation. "Ms. Chen, I have to say this is one of the most unusual situations I've encountered in 25 years of legal practice. I've been thinking about this case all morning, trying to figure out how to balance justice, practicality, and the simple fact that your sister has been doing excellent work in a position she obtained through fraud."
Justice Morrison settled into the chair beside Ophelia, her presence somehow both supported and official. "Robert, I thought it would be helpful for Ophelia to hear directly from you about Vivian's performance, and for you to understand the full scope of what happened here." "Of course." Justice Williams pulled a file from his desk and opened it carefully. "Let me start by saying that the law clerk I know as Vivian Chen has been exceptional. Her legal briefs are thorough and well-reasoned. Her research is meticulous, and she has a genuine gift for finding precedents that other clerks might miss. She works long hours without complaint, asks thoughtful questions, and has already contributed to several important opinions." He paused, looking directly at Ophelia with an expression that seemed to be measuring her reaction. "But now I understand that these capabilities may have been developed under circumstances very different from what she described in her application. Can you tell me about your own legal education and experience?" Ophelia felt the familiar ache of discussing dreams deferred, but she forced herself to speak clearly and honestly. "I completed 3 years at Yale, magna cum laude in political science with a minor in philosophy. My senior thesis was on constitutional interpretation and original intent versus living document theory. I scored 173 on the LSAT and was accepted to Columbia Law School with a partial scholarship." "And you left Columbia because—" "My father became seriously ill with diabetic complications. The medical bills were overwhelming, and my parents needed help with his care. I withdrew at the end of my first year to work and help support the family." The words came easier now than they had 6 months ago, perhaps because she was finally saying them to people who understood the weight of sacrifice, the complexity of choices that looked simple from the outside. Justice Williams made notes as she spoke, his pen moving across the paper with the steady rhythm of someone accustomed to documenting testimony. "What was your GPA at Columbia during that first year?" 3.7. I was struggling a bit with the adjustment, the workload, but I was also working 20 hours a week at a law firm in Queens to help with expenses. My professors said I had promise, that I should consider reapplying once my family situation stabilized." "And you did? Reapply?" Ophelia felt heat rise in her cheeks. "No. By the time my father passed away, I felt like I'd been out of school too long. And honestly, the debt from his medical care was substantial. It seemed more responsible to keep working, to help my mother rebuild financially, than to take on more student loans for a degree that felt like a luxury we couldn't afford." Justice Williams set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Miss Chen, I've been a federal judge for 8 years, and before that I spent 15 years in private practice. I've worked with hundreds of law clerks, recent graduates, and experienced attorneys. What you just described, leaving school to care for a family member, working multiple jobs while maintaining high grades, sacrificing your own ambitions for family responsibility, those experiences create exactly the kind of legal mind that makes for exceptional clerks." "What do you mean?" "Law isn't just about memorizing cases and applying precedents. It's about understanding human complexity, the real-world consequences of legal decisions, the way that rules interact with people's actual lives. Someone who has made difficult choices, who has balanced competing obligations, who has experienced both academic success and personal setback, that person brings a perspective to legal analysis that can't be taught in any classroom."
Justice Morrison nodded. Which is why your sister's work here has been so strong. She's been drawing on experiences and insights that were actually yours, applying a depth of understanding that came from your struggles, not hers. Ophelia felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. For 6 months, people had treated her withdrawal from law school as a failure, a sign that she hadn't been serious about her legal career. Her own family had sometimes implied that she'd given up too easily, that a truly dedicated student would have found a way to stay in school despite the circumstances. But here were two of the most respected legal minds in the country telling her that her experiences had value, that her sacrifices had created exactly the kind of perspective that the law needed. Justice Williams, she said carefully, what happens now? To Vivian and to the clerkship? The justices exchanged a long look with Justice Morrison before answering. That's complicated. Your sister has clearly committed fraud, federal fraud, given that this involves a government position requiring security clearance. The FBI will need to investigate, and the U.S. Attorney's Office will have to decide whether to prosecute. But there's also the question of what to do about the position itself. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Capitol dome gleaming in the afternoon sun. Here's what I've been thinking about all morning, Miss Chen. Your sister obtained this position using your credentials, your achievements, your personal story. But the work she's been doing, the legal analysis, the research, the writing, that's been hers. She's been applying stolen credentials to perform authentic work. Meanwhile, Justice Morrison added, you have the legitimate credentials, but not the completed legal education that we typically require for this position. It's an unprecedented situation. But not without precedent for creative solutions, Justice Williams said, turning back to face them. Miss Chen, would you be interested in returning to law school to complete your degree? The question hung in the air like a bridge between her current life and the future she'd abandoned 3 years ago. Ophelia felt her heart rate quicken. Yes, of course I would be interested, but I can't afford it. I'm still paying off my father's medical bills, and I need to work to help support my mother. Student loans for law school, especially starting over as a second-year student at my age? What if the financial obstacles weren't a concern? Justice Morrison asked. What if there was a way to complete your legal education while also addressing the justice aspects of the situation? Ophelia looked between the two justices, trying to read the subtext in their careful questions. I'm not sure I understand what you're suggesting. Justice Williams returned to his desk and pulled out another file. The Supreme Court has a discretionary fund for unusual circumstances, and this certainly qualifies. We could potentially fund your return to law school, tuition, living expenses, everything you'd need to complete your degree. In exchange, you would commit to a 2-year clerkship here after graduation, assuming you maintain appropriate grades. But that still doesn't address the immediate problem, Justice Morrison said. Your sister is currently occupying a position based on fraudulent credentials. She can't continue in that role regardless of her performance. Which brings me to my proposal, Justice Williams said. What if we created a hybrid position? You would return to law school part-time, probably evening classes at Georgetown or George Washington University. During the day, you would work here as a legal research assistant. Not a full law clerk position, since you haven't graduated yet, but something that would give you practical experience while also helping us handle the workload. Ophelia's breath caught. You're offering me a job here? I'm offering you an opportunity to earn your way into the position your sister stole, Justice Williams clarified. It wouldn't be easy. You'd be working full-time and attending law school at night, completing your degree over 3 years instead of 2. But you'd be gaining experience that most law students never get, working on cases that could shape constitutional law for decades. And your sister? Ophelia asked quietly.
The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Justice Morrison's voice became formal, judicial. Your sister will need to face the legal consequences of her actions. Identity theft, document fraud, making false statements to federal investigators. These are serious charges, but the specific penalties will depend on many factors, including whether she cooperates with the investigation and whether she shows genuine remorse for what she's done. She's also made restitution complicated, Justice Williams added. She's been paid a full salary for 6 weeks of work she performed under false pretenses. She's used stolen credentials to build professional relationships and gain access to confidential information. Even if she agrees to repay the money, the professional damage is significant. Ophelia found herself thinking about Vivian's Instagram posts from the honeymoon, the carefully curated images of happiness and success. All of it built on stolen foundations, sustained by lies that were finally collapsing under the weight of their own complexity. Part of her felt a fierce satisfaction that justice was finally possible, that someone with real authority was taking her seriously. But another part, the part that remembered sharing secrets and fears with her twin sister, felt hollow with grief. "When would you need an answer?" she asked. "Soon," Justice Morrison said. "Your sister is scheduled to work on a preliminary opinion draft tomorrow morning. We can't allow someone with fraudulent credentials to continue handling sensitive materials, especially now that we know the truth. But we also can't leave Justice Williams without clerical support indefinitely," David Park added. He had been taking notes silently throughout the conversation, but now he looked up with something that might have been sympathy. "Ms. Chen, I know this is overwhelming. Maybe it would help if you could see what the work environment is actually like here. Meet some of the other clerks. Understand what you'd be walking into." Justice Williams nodded. "That's an excellent suggestion. David, could you arrange for Ms. Chen to spend the rest of the afternoon observing the clerk's work? Let her see what she'd be signing up for before she makes a decision that will affect the next several years of her life." As they prepared to leave Justice Williams' office, he stopped Ophelia with a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Ms. Chen, I want you to understand something. What your sister did to you was unconscionable. Identity theft is always a violation, but stealing someone's academic achievements, their life story, their path to professional success, that's a particularly cruel form of theft. You have every right to be angry, every right to demand justice. But I also want you to know that this situation, terrible as it is, has revealed something important. The credentials your sister used to get this position, they're legitimately yours. The potential she demonstrated in her work here, that potential belongs to you too, because it was built on experiences and insights that came from your sacrifices, your struggles, your genuine achievements. This isn't charity or pity. This is recognition of merit that was always yours to claim." As Ophelia followed David Park through the corridors of the Supreme Court building toward the clerk's workspace, she felt like she was walking through a dream that might dissolve if she moved too quickly or thought too hard about what was happening. 6 months ago, she had been invisible, her complaints dismissed as family drama by authorities who couldn't be bothered to investigate. Now she was being offered not just vindication, but opportunity, the chance to reclaim not only her stolen identity, but her abandoned dreams. The clerk's office was a busy, focused space where 4 young lawyers worked at individual desks surrounded by towering stacks of case files, legal precedents, and draft opinions. The atmosphere was intense, but collegial, with the kind of focused energy that came from working on matters of national importance. As David introduced her to the other clerks, Ophelia found herself wondering if she really belonged in this world, if she could handle the pressure and intellectual demands of Supreme Court work. Then she remembered that Vivian had been handling it successfully for 6 weeks, drawing on achievements and experiences that were actually Ophelia's. If her stolen credentials had been good enough to excel here, then surely the authentic version, the real Ophelia Chen, with
Genuine struggles and legitimate accomplishments, could not only survive in this environment, but thrive. The confrontation came at 9:47 p.m. that same evening,
in the form of a phone call that would later divide Ophelia's life into before and after, the way traumatic events create permanent fault lines in memory. She was sitting in her hotel room near Union Station, reviewing the Georgetown Law School evening program materials that David Park had given her, when her phone buzzed with Vivian's name on the caller ID. For a moment, Ophelia stared at the screen, watching her sister's contact photo, a selfie from last Christmas where they both wore matching red sweaters their mother had insisted on, their faces pressed together in an approximation of sisterly closeness that now felt like archaeological evidence of a relationship that no longer existed. She could let it go to voicemail, could avoid this conversation until lawyers and federal agents forced it to happen in some sterile government office. But 6 months of silence and evasion had taught her that delayed confrontations only grew more painful with time. "Hello, Vivian." "Oh, thank God you answered." Vivian's voice was high and tight with panic, stripped of the casual confidence that had always characterized her speech. "Ophelia, something terrible is happening. I need your help. There are FBI agents at my apartment, asking questions about my job, about my background check, about—" Her voice broke. "They know. Somehow they found out about the credit cards and the identity stuff, and they're saying I committed federal crimes. Federal crimes, Ophelia. They want to arrest me." Ophelia closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the day settling over her like a lead blanket. In Justice Williams's office, surrounded by marble and mahogany and the trappings of institutional authority, the conversation about justice and consequences felt abstract, almost academic. But now, hearing the raw terror in her twin sister's voice, the human cost of this reckoning became impossible to ignore. "Vivian, I know about the Supreme Court job. I know you used my transcripts, my LSAT scores, my personal statements. I know you've been working there for 6 months using my identity." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough for Ophelia to hear her own heartbeat. When Vivian finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "How did you find out?" "Justice Morrison called me at 4 in the morning yesterday. They discovered the identity fraud during a routine background check investigation." Ophelia stood up and walked to the hotel window, looking out at the lights of Washington, D.C. spread below her like a circuit board. "They know everything, Vivian. The wedding expenses, the credit cards, the fake driver's license, all of it. And now they know about the job fraud, too." "But I've been doing good work." Vivian's voice rose to a near shout, desperation making her sound younger, more like the sister Ophelia remembered from childhood arguments. "Justice Williams says I'm one of the best clerks he's ever had. I'm not some criminal. I'm not trying to hurt anyone. I just wanted to have the life you were supposed to have, the life you threw away when you quit law school." The accusation hit like a physical blow. "I threw away?" "You had everything, Ophelia. The perfect grades, the test scores, the law school acceptance. You could have had any job you wanted, any future you wanted, and you just walked away from it to take care of Dad like some kind of martyred saint. Do you know what it was like watching everyone praise you for your sacrifice, while I was just the other twin, the one who wasn't noble enough to give up her dreams?" Tears were streaming down Ophelia's face now, hot and unexpected. "So you stole my dreams instead?" "I borrowed your credentials to live the life you abandoned. You weren't using them anymore. You were working as a paralegal in Queens, making $30,000 a year and acting like that was some kind of noble calling. Those achievements were just sitting there, wasted, while I was struggling to find decent opportunities with my mediocre Fordham grades." "Those achievements were mine, Vivian. My work, my sacrifices, my choices. You don't get to decide that I abandoned them just because I made different decisions than you would have made." "Different decisions?" Vivian's laugh was bitter and harsh. "You made the same decision you always make, Ophelia. You chose to be the responsible one, the good daughter, the one who sacrifices herself so everyone else can feel guilty and grateful.
But you never asked if anyone wanted your sacrifice. You never asked if it actually helped anyone. The words cut deeper than Ophelia had expected, partly because they contained a grain of truth she'd never wanted to examine. Had her sacrifice for their father been genuinely necessary, or had it been partly driven by her need to be seen as the good daughter, the reliable one, the sister who could be counted on when things got difficult? That doesn't give you the right to steal my identity and live my life. I didn't steal your life. I used the life you threw away, and I made something beautiful with it. Do you know what I've accomplished in the past 6 weeks? I've helped research opinions that will affect millions of people. I've contributed to constitutional law that will be studied for decades. I've done work that actually matters, using credentials that were collecting dust in a folder in my closet. Using my name, using my story, using achievements I earned through years of work you never did. Fine. Vivian's voice cracked completely. Fine. You want your precious identity back? You want everyone to know what a victim you are? How terribly your sister treated you? You win, Ophelia. You get to be the martyred saint again, sacrificing yourself for justice this time instead of for Dad. I hope it makes you feel as superior as you always need to feel. The line went quiet except for the sound of Vivian crying, harsh sobs that carried decades of sisterly resentment, competition, and love twisted into something unrecognizable. Ophelia found herself thinking about their childhood, about the ways they had defined themselves in opposition to each other, even while sharing a room, sharing secrets, sharing the particular intimacy that comes from being born into the world together. Vivian, I never wanted to feel superior to you. I never wanted any of this to happen. But it did happen. Vivian's voice was thick with tears, but steadier now, resigned. And now I'm going to lose everything. My job, my reputation, my marriage probably. Marcus is already asking questions about where the money for the wedding came from, why the FBI is involved, whether he's married to some kind of criminal. You could have avoided all of this if you had just talked to me, if you had asked for help instead of stealing my identity. Asked for what help? Asked you to give me your transcript so I could pretend to be smarter than I am? Asked you to let me borrow your achievements so I could feel successful? There's no version of this conversation that doesn't end with me being the lesser twin, the one who needed your help to succeed. Ophelia sank back into the hotel room chair, emotionally exhausted. So you chose to be the twin who stole from her sister and committed federal fraud? I chose to be the twin who took action instead of accepting defeat. But I guess it doesn't matter now. Vivian's voice was flat with defeat. The FBI agents want me to come in for questioning.
Tomorrow morning. My lawyer says I should cooperate, tell them everything, maybe get a plea deal that doesn't include prison time. Prison time? Identity theft, wire fraud, making false statements to federal investigators. Apparently, these are serious felonies when they involve government positions. My lawyer says I could be looking at several years in federal prison if they decide to prosecute fully. The reality of that possibility hit Ophelia like cold water. For all her anger, all her sense of betrayal and violation, the idea of Vivian in federal prison seemed impossible to process. This was her twin sister, the person who had shared her mother's womb, who knew all her childhood fears and dreams, who had held her hand during their father's funeral, even while she was secretly planning to steal her identity. Vivian, what do you want me to do? What would actually help you at this point? I don't know. The admission seemed to cost Vivian something essential. Maybe just remember that I'm not evil. Selfish, yes. Desperate, definitely. But not evil. I never wanted to hurt you, Ophelia. I just wanted to stop feeling like the disappointment, the sister who couldn't measure up. After Vivian hung up, Ophelia sat in the darkened hotel room for hours, staring out at the lights of the capital city and trying to understand how two people who had started life as identical selves could have ended up so fundamentally different in their understanding of right and wrong, sacrifice and responsibility, love and betrayal.
Tomorrow, she would meet with FBI investigators to give her full statement. Tomorrow, she would formally accept Justice Williams's offer to return to law school and work at the Supreme Court, reclaiming the future that had been stolen from her. Tomorrow, she would begin the long process of rebuilding her credit, her reputation, her sense of safety in the world. But tonight, she mourned not just for her stolen identity, but for the sister she had lost, not to arrest or prosecution or federal charges, but to choices that had revealed the person Vivian had always been beneath the surface of their sisterly intimacy. The betrayal wasn't just about the theft. It was about the discovery that the person she had loved and trusted most in the world was capable of causing her this much harm while convincing herself that she was the real victim of their family's circumstances. Outside her window, Washington, D.C. hummed with the business of governance and justice, of laws written and applied and enforced. But inside the hotel room, Ophelia Chen wept for simpler losses, the end of unconditional trust, the death of sisterly loyalty, and the terrible knowledge that some betrayals are so profound they change not just your present and future, but your understanding of everything that came before. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning in April, delivered by hand to Ophelia's apartment in Georgetown, where she had been living since starting her final semester of law school. The envelope was heavy cream paper, embossed with the kind of formal script that suggested expensive weddings or prestigious ceremonies. For a moment, holding it in her hands, she felt the familiar clench of anxiety that had become her body's automatic response to unexpected mail. 3 years of dealing with identity theft aftermath had trained her nervous system to treat every document as a potential threat. But this wasn't a credit card statement or a collections notice or another legal document requiring her attention. The return address read simply, Morrison Foundation for Legal Education, and when she opened it, she found an invitation to speak at the Foundation's annual symposium on identity crime and judicial ethics. The theme of this year's conference was Stolen Lives When Personal Identity Becomes Legal Evidence, and Justice Patricia Morrison was requesting that Ophelia deliver the keynote address. It had been 18 months since the last time she had spoken publicly about her experience, and that had been in a very different context, a federal courtroom in Manhattan where she had delivered a victim impact statement during Vivian's sentencing hearing. Her sister had ultimately pled guilty to federal fraud charges and served 14 months in minimum security federal prison, followed by 2 years of supervised probation and community service. The prosecution had been surprisingly sympathetic to the family dynamics involved, acknowledging that identity theft between siblings represented a complex form of victimization that traditional criminal justice frameworks struggled to address adequately. But the invitation wasn't asking her to talk about victimization. It was asking her to discuss recovery, redemption, and the ways that legal institutions could better serve people whose lives had been stolen and reconstructed by others. It was asking her to speak as someone who had not only survived identity theft, but had used it as a catalyst for reclaiming the life she was meant to live. Ophelia set the invitation on her kitchen table next to her laptop, where she had been working on her law review article about identity crime and restorative justice, research that had grown out of her own experience and would be published in the Georgetown Law Journal next month. Outside her window, Georgetown Law School hummed with the energy of spring semester, students hurrying between classes with arms full of casebooks and the particular urgency that characterized the final weeks before graduation. She would graduate in 6 weeks, 4 years after first walking away from Columbia Law School to care for her dying father. Her grades were excellent, not perfect because working full-time at the Supreme Court while attending evening classes left little time for the kind of obsessive studying that had characterized her undergraduate years, but strong enough to graduate magna cum laude and earn offers from several prestigious law firms. More importantly, she had work experience that most new graduates could only dream of. 3 years as a research assistant to Justice Williams, contributing to opinions that have shaped constitutional interpretation on issues ranging from voting rights to digital privacy. The phone rang just as she was debating whether to accept the speaking invitation. David Park's name appeared on her caller ID, and she answered with the easy familiarity of someone who had worked closely with a colleague for years. "Ophelia, do you have a few minutes?"
Justice Williams wants to discuss your post-graduation plans, and there's something else we need to talk about regarding your sister." Her heart rate quickened at the mention of Vivian. Since her release from prison 8 months ago, they had maintained a careful distance, communicating only through their mother when family logistics required coordination. Vivian was living in Philadelphia now, working as a paralegal at a small immigration law firm and slowly rebuilding her professional reputation. They had not spoken directly since that terrible phone call 3 years ago, though Ophelia received regular updates about her sister's progress through her mother's worried reports. What about Vivian? She wrote to Justice Williams last month requesting a meeting to discuss her case and its impact on your career here. She wants to apologize formally, on the record, and she's asking about the possibility of making financial restitution for the position she obtained fraudulently. Ophelia sank into her kitchen chair, processing this information. She wants to apologize? After 3 years? According to her letter, she's been working with a counselor who specializes in family fraud cases. She's apparently gained some insight into the psychological factors that led to her decisions, and she wants to take formal responsibility for the harm she caused. But Justice Williams won't agree to meet with her without your permission. This is your experience, your recovery process, and he won't do anything that might interfere with your healing. The word healing hit Ophelia unexpectedly. She had spent so much time focused on the practical aspects of recovery, rebuilding her credit, completing law school, establishing her professional reputation, that she hadn't given much thought to the psychological dimensions of what she had experienced. But now, 3 years later, she could recognize the ways that Vivian's betrayal had changed her relationship to trust, family, and her own sense of security in the world. "David, can I think about this? I need some time to process what it would mean to see her again, especially in that context." "Of course. But Ophelia, there's something else you should know. Justice Williams is planning to offer you a permanent position as his clerk when you graduate. Not just the 2-year commitment you originally agreed to, but a permanent staff position that could lead to other opportunities within the federal court system."
This was news that should have filled her with excitement, but instead she felt a strange ambivalence. The Supreme Court had become her professional home, the place where she had discovered her own capabilities and built her legal expertise. But it was also the place where she had arrived through trauma, where every achievement felt somehow connected to her sister's betrayal. Sometimes she wondered if her success there was genuinely her own, or if it was simply the institutional response to an unusual situation that had required creative solutions. "David, do you think I earned this position, or am I here because the court felt guilty about what happened to me?" The question hung in the air between them, carrying 3 years of self-doubt and imposter syndrome that Ophelia had never quite managed to shake. Even as her confidence in her legal abilities had grown, even as Justice Williams had increasingly relied on her research and analysis, part of her worried that she was the beneficiary of institutional pity rather than recognition of merit. "Ophelia, I've worked with dozens of clerks over the years, and I've never seen Justice Williams invest in someone's career the way he's invested in yours. That's not pity, that's recognition of exceptional talent and dedication. You didn't just recover from what your sister did to you, you transformed it into professional excellence that has impressed everyone who's worked with you." After David hung up, Ophelia walked to her bedroom and pulled out a folder she kept in the back of her closet. Documentation of everything that happened 3 years ago, including transcripts of FBI interviews, court records from Vivian's prosecution, and copies of all the fraudulent documents that had started this entire ordeal. She hadn't looked at these papers in over a year, but now she found herself studying them with the analytical skills she had developed during law school. What struck her most was how much her perspective had changed. 3 years ago, reading Vivian's falsified personal statement felt like reading her own obituary, the theft of her story, her struggles, her identity. But now, she could see it differently. Vivian had stolen the facts of Ophelia's experiences, but she hadn't understood their deeper meaning.
The personal statement read like a caricature of perseverance, hitting all the right notes about overcoming adversity without demonstrating real understanding of what those experiences had actually taught. The real value of leaving law school to care for her father hadn't been the narrative of sacrifice that looked good on applications. It had been the deeper lessons about legal systems and human dignity that came from navigating Medicare bureaucracies, insurance claim denials, and the complex intersection of healthcare law and family responsibilities. It had been learning that legal expertise was meaningless without empathy, that the most elegant constitutional theories fell apart when confronted with the messy realities of people's actual lives. Vivian had stolen Ophelia's achievements, but she hadn't been able to steal the wisdom that came from genuinely living those experiences. And that wisdom, Ophelia realized, was what had made her valuable to Justice Williams and to the Supreme Court. It wasn't just her academic credentials or her research skills, it was her ability to see legal questions through the lens of real human consequences, to understand that every constitutional interpretation had the potential to change someone's life in profound and permanent ways. The next morning, Ophelia called Justice Williams directly, rather than going through David Park. It was an unusual breach of protocol, but after 3 years of working together, their relationship had evolved beyond formal hierarchies. Justice Williams, I've been thinking about Vivian's request to meet with you. I'd like to be present for that conversation if you're willing to arrange it. Are you certain? This could be emotionally challenging, and there's no legal requirement for you to participate. I'm certain, but I'd like to propose something different than what she's requesting. Instead of focusing on apologies or restitution, I'd like to have a conversation about redemption and second chances, about what it means to rebuild after making choices that harm the people you love most. Justice Williams was quiet for a long moment. What did you have in mind?
I've been invited to speak at Justice Morrison's symposium on identity crime. What if I use that opportunity to discuss not just victimization, but recovery? What if I talked about the ways that institutions can create pathways for healing that benefit both victims and perpetrators? And what if I asked Vivian to participate in that discussion? You want your sister to speak publicly about what she did? I want my sister to have the opportunity to contribute something meaningful to the conversation about identity crime, rather than just being an example of criminality that people use to illustrate the need for harsher penalties. She understands the psychology of identity theft from the inside, in ways that could help other families avoid similar tragedies. It was a radical idea, born from 3 years of thinking about justice as something more complex than punishment, more nuanced than the simple division between victims and perpetrators. Ophelia had spent her law school years studying restorative justice models, family court innovations, and alternative approaches to criminal behavior that focused on healing communities rather than simply penalizing individuals. Ophelia, are you prepared for the possibility that this could reopen old wounds? That working with Vivian in this context might be more difficult than you anticipate? Justice Williams, 3 years ago, I thought justice meant seeing my sister punished for what she did to me. And that did happen. She was prosecuted, convicted, imprisoned. But none of that actually healed the harm she caused, to me or to our family. It just created a different kind of damage. She paused, looking out her apartment window at students walking across the Georgetown campus. Young people at the beginning of their legal careers, full of idealism about the law's capacity to create fairness and order in a chaotic world. I want to try something different. I want to see if there's a version of justice that actually restores what was broken, rather than just punishing the person who broke it. The symposium took place on a crisp morning in May in the Hart Senate office building, where Justice Morrison's foundation had reserved the largest conference room available. The space was filled with federal judges, law enforcement officials, victim advocacy groups, and legal scholars who had come to discuss the evolving landscape of identity crime and institutional responses to personal fraud. Ophelia stood at the podium, looking out at an audience that included some of the most influential figures in American jurisprudence,
people whose decisions shaped the lives of millions of citizens every day. But her eyes kept drifting to the back row, where Vivian sat in a navy suit that looked professional but inexpensive, her hands folded in her lap with the careful composure of someone who understood that she was present by invitation rather than by right. They had met the night before for the first time in 3 years, a careful conversation in a quiet restaurant near Capitol Hill where they had attempted to navigate the strange territory of sisterhood after betrayal, family love after criminal prosecution. Vivian looked different, older, more serious, with a gravity in her expression that hadn't been there before her arrest and imprisonment. The easy confidence that had always characterized her demeanor had been replaced by something more careful, more aware of consequences. When she had apologized the night before, it had been without the desperate self-justification that had marked their last phone call. Instead, she had spoken quietly about the therapy she had received in prison, the insights she had gained about the psychological dynamics that had led her to rationalize stealing her sister's identity. "I told myself I was using credentials you had abandoned," Vivian had said, her voice steady but quiet, "but I knew that wasn't true. I knew I was stealing something that belonged to you, something you had earned through sacrifices I wasn't willing to make myself. I convinced myself that I deserved your achievements because I was smarter than my grades suggested, because I had potential that wasn't being recognized. But potential isn't achievement. Intent isn't accomplishment. I stole years of your work and told myself it was justified because I was capable of doing good things with it." Now, standing at the podium of the symposium, Ophelia felt the weight of that conversation as she began her remarks. She had prepared extensively, but the words that came out were more
personal than her scripted speech, drawn from 3 years of thinking about the nature of identity, achievement, and the complex relationship between personal and professional recovery. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished colleagues, I want to begin by saying that identity theft is not just a financial crime. It's not even primarily a financial crime. It's the theft of narrative, of history, of the story that connects our past achievements to our future possibilities. When someone steals your identity, they don't just take your money or damage your credit score. They take your place in your own life story. The room was absolutely silent, the kind of focused attention that came when an audience sensed they were hearing something genuinely important rather than routine conference remarks. Ophelia continued, drawing on her own experience but speaking in the analytical language that would resonate with her professional audience. 3 years ago, my twin sister used my academic credentials to secure a law clerk position at the Supreme Court. She used my transcripts, my test scores, my personal statement about overcoming adversity to claim achievements that had taken me years to earn. But more than that, she used my experiences, my decision to leave law school to care for our dying father, my financial struggles, my sacrifices, and repackaged them as her own inspiring narrative of perseverance. She glanced toward the back row where Vivian was listening with an expression that seemed equal parts shame and attention. The traditional criminal justice response to this situation was straightforward: prosecution, conviction, imprisonment, restitution. My sister was held accountable for her crimes according to established legal frameworks. But what that process didn't address was the more complex question of how to restore what had been stolen, not just financially, but personally and professionally. Justice Morrison, sitting in the front row, nodded slightly. She had been instrumental in developing the symposium's focus on restorative rather than purely punitive responses to identity crime, recognizing that traditional legal remedies often failed to address the full scope of harm caused by personal fraud. The Supreme Court's response to this situation was creative and unprecedented, Ophelia continued. Rather than simply removing my sister from the position she had obtained fraudulently, Justice Williams offered me the opportunity to earn my way into a legitimate version of that same position. I was given financial support to complete law school while working as a research assistant, essentially allowing me to claim the professional opportunity that my stolen credentials had made possible. She paused, seeing nods of recognition from several audience members who were familiar with her case from legal journalism coverage. But this solution, generous and creative as it was, still treated the situation as a zero-sum equation.
My sister lost the position, I gained it, justice was served. What it didn't address was the possibility that both victim and perpetrator might have something valuable to contribute to understanding and preventing this type of crime. This was the moment where her remarks would deviate from typical victim advocacy, where she would propose something that might seem radical to an audience accustomed to thinking about crime in terms of clear moral categories. She took a deep breath and continued, "Which brings me to why my sister, Vivian Chen, is here with us today, not as a defendant or an example of criminal behavior, but as someone who has spent 3 years developing insights into the psychology of identity theft that could be invaluable for prevention efforts, family education, and institutional responses to personal fraud." A murmur ran through the audience, the kind of surprised reaction that came when expectations were suddenly challenged. Ophelia pressed forward, committed now to the unconventional approach she had developed over months of careful consideration. Vivian is going to join me for the second half of this presentation to discuss her experience from the perspective of someone who committed identity fraud, served her sentence, and has spent considerable time in therapy trying to understand the psychological and social factors that led to her decisions. Her insights, combined with my experience as a victim, might provide a more complete picture of how identity crime develops and how institutions might respond more effectively.
She gestured toward the back of the room, and Vivian stood slowly, making her way to the front of the room with the careful dignity of someone who understood that her presence there was both privilege and penance. As she took her place at the podium beside Ophelia, the sisters stood together in front of an audience of some of the most powerful figures in American law. Not as victim and perpetrator, but as two people who had found a way to transform personal tragedy into public education. "Before I turn the microphone over to Vivian," Ophelia said, "I want to emphasize that this is not about forgiveness or reconciliation, though those have been part of our personal journey. This is about recognizing that complex crimes require complex solutions, and that the people who commit these crimes often have insights that could prevent others from making similar choices." Vivian stepped forward, her hands visibly shaking as she gripped the edges of the podium. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but clear, carrying the weight of someone who had spent years thinking about the words she was about to say. "3 years ago, I made a series of decisions that destroyed my relationship with my sister, damaged my family, violated federal law, and ultimately sent me to prison. I used Ophelia's academic achievements to obtain a Supreme Court clerkship that I hadn't earned, funded a lavish wedding with credit cards opened in her name, and convinced myself that I was justified in doing so because she had abandoned the opportunities I was claiming." The room was absolutely silent now, the kind of focused attention that came when people were hearing something unprecedented. Federal criminals rarely spoke at legal symposiums, especially not about their own crimes in analytical rather than purely apologetic terms. What I want to discuss with you today is not the mechanics of identity theft. Those are well documented in law enforcement literature. What I want to explore is the psychological progression that allows someone to rationalize stealing the identity of the person they love most in the world, and what institutional responses might interrupt that progression before it leads to criminal behavior. Vivian pulled out a folder of notes, her preparation evident in the organized way she approached her remarks. The first factor was what my prison counselor called achievement envy. I had spent our entire childhood being compared to Ophelia. Her grades were higher, her test scores were better, her academic achievements were consistently more impressive than mine. But instead of using that as motivation to work harder, I internalized a narrative that the comparison was unfair, that I was just as smart as she was, but that the system somehow favored her. She glanced at Ophelia before continuing. The second factor was what I now understand as sacrifice resentment.
When Ophelia left law school to care for our father, everyone in our family praised her as heroic, selfless, noble, but I felt angry that she had made a choice that made the rest of us look selfish by comparison. Instead of admiring her sacrifice, I resented it because it highlighted my own unwillingness to make similar sacrifices. Justice Morrison leaned forward slightly, clearly engaged with this psychological analysis from someone who had lived it from the inside. This was exactly the kind of insight that traditional criminal justice processes rarely captured, the complex emotional dynamics that led to criminal decisions. The third factor was opportunity combined with rationalization, Vivian continued. I had access to Ophelia's personal documents, her social security number, her academic records, and I convinced myself that since she wasn't using these achievements, since she was working as a paralegal rather than pursuing the legal career her credentials could have supported, I wasn't really stealing anything valuable. She paused, her voice becoming quieter but more intense. What I didn't understand then, what I refused to acknowledge, was that Ophelia's choice to leave law school wasn't abandonment of her achievements. It was another achievement, a different kind of accomplishment that demonstrated values I wasn't mature enough to recognize. She chose family responsibility over personal ambition, chose sacrifice over self-advancement, chose love over career advancement. Those were achievements too, just not the kind that show up on resumes or law school applications. The audience was completely engaged now, recognizing that they were hearing a level of self-analysis that was both rare and professionally valuable. This wasn't the usual criminal
Apologetics. This was someone who had developed genuine insight into the psychological mechanisms that led to her crimes. The final factor was escalation, Vivian said. Identity theft is rarely a single decision. It's a series of small violations that gradually normalize larger ones. It started with a credit card I told myself I would pay back. Then it was jewelry I convinced myself I deserved. Then it was wedding expenses I rationalized as temporary borrowing. By the time I was using Ophelia's academic credentials to apply for jobs, the psychological barriers to theft had been eroded by months of smaller violations. She turned slightly toward her sister. What makes this case unusual is that I wasn't just stealing Ophelia's financial information. I was stealing her identity in the most literal sense. I was claiming her experiences as my own, her struggles as my narrative, her achievements as my qualifications. I was trying to become her because I couldn't accept being myself. Justice Williams, who had been listening from the middle of the audience, raised his hand. Ms. Chen, based on your experience, what institutional responses might have prevented this escalation? What intervention points might have changed the trajectory of your decision-making? Vivian considered the question carefully. First, earlier intervention for family fraud. When Ophelia first reported suspicious credit card activity, the institutional response was to treat it as a civil matter rather than a crime. If there had been immediate investigation and consequences for the initial theft, the escalation to more serious fraud might not have occurred. Second, better psychological screening for positions requiring security clearance. The background check process focused on verifying information, but didn't include psychological assessment that might have revealed the emotional instability that led to my deception. Third, family education about identity protection. Most people don't realize how easy it is for family members to access each other's personal information, or how that access can be misused. Simple protective measures, separate storage of documents, regular credit monitoring, clear boundaries around sharing personal information might prevent many cases of family identity theft. Justice Morrison stood up. Ms. Chen, you mentioned that you've been working with a counselor who specializes in family fraud cases. Can you tell us about that therapeutic approach and whether it might be applicable to other offenders? The therapy focused on what Dr. Sarah Martinez calls identity integration, helping people who have committed identity crimes understand their own authentic identity separate from the person they stole from.
Many identity thieves, especially family members, are struggling with their own sense of inadequacy or comparison. The therapeutic process involves developing genuine self-worth based on authentic achievements rather than stolen ones. Vivian pulled out another folder. I've also been working with Dr. Martinez to develop what we're calling family fraud prevention protocols, educational materials and counseling approaches that could be used with families who are experiencing identity theft issues before they escalate to criminal behavior. She turned slightly toward her sister. Ophelia and I have been meeting monthly for the past 6 months to work through these protocols, to understand the family dynamics that contributed to my choices, and to develop strategies that other families might use to address similar situations before they require law enforcement intervention. This was news to most of the audience, including several people who knew Ophelia professionally. The idea that victim and perpetrator were collaborating on prevention education represented a radically different approach to identity crime than traditional criminal justice models. Ophelia stepped back to the microphone. What Vivian hasn't mentioned is that this collaboration has been as valuable for my recovery as it has been for her rehabilitation. Understanding the psychology behind her choices has helped me process the betrayal in ways that traditional victim services couldn't address. It's allowed me to separate the personal hurt from the criminal behavior, to understand that her choices were about her own psychological struggles rather than about our relationship or my worth as a person.
She gestured to include her sister. This doesn't mean that criminal behavior should be excused or that victims should be required to work with their perpetrators, but it does suggest that in some cases, particularly family fraud cases, restorative approaches might serve both justice and healing better than purely punitive responses. Justice Morrison stood again. Before we open this up for questions, I want to ask both of you about the long-term outcomes. Ophelia, you're about to graduate from law school and begin a permanent position at the Supreme Court. Vivian, you've been working as a paralegal while developing these educational materials. How do you both envision your futures, personally and professionally? Ophelia answered first. Professionally, I'm committed to specializing in identity crime law, working with both victims and institutions to develop more effective responses to personal fraud. Personally, Vivian and I are rebuilding our relationship on a foundation of honesty and accountability that we never had before. We're sisters again, but we're different sisters. People who understand the real costs of betrayal and the hard work required for genuine trust. Vivian nodded. I'm applying to law school for next year, planning to specialize in family law and restorative justice. I want to work with families who are dealing with fraud situations before they require criminal prosecution. And personally, I'm learning to be proud of my own achievements rather than envious of someone else's. It's harder work than I expected, building authentic self-worth, but it's the only foundation for a life that doesn't require stealing from other people. The questions that followed were thoughtful and engaged, focusing on practical applications of the insights they had shared rather than sensational details about the crime itself. Federal prosecutors wanted to know about early intervention strategies. Family court judges asked about therapeutic approaches that might be effective with adolescent identity thieves. Victim advocacy groups inquired about the psychological factors that made some victims more vulnerable to family fraud. But the most powerful moment came when a young law student in the back row raised her hand. Miss Chen, both of you, I'm wondering about forgiveness. How do you forgive someone who steals your identity? And how do you forgive yourself for stealing someone else's? Ophelia and Vivian looked at each other, a moment of silent communication that spoke to years of difficult conversations and gradual healing. Ophelia answered first. Forgiveness isn't a moment. It's a process. And it's not about excusing what happened or pretending it didn't matter. For me, forgiveness has been about choosing to define myself by my recovery rather than by the harm that was done to me. It's been about reclaiming my agency, my future, my sense of who I am separate from being a victim. Vivian's voice was quiet when she responded.
Self-forgiveness has been harder than earning Ophelia's forgiveness, honestly. She could see my actions in the context of our entire relationship, our family history, the complexity of human psychology. But I had to face the fact that I was capable of causing terrible harm to someone I loved, that I had made choices that violated everything I claimed to believe about right and wrong. The path to self-forgiveness has been through action, making amends, not just with apologies, but with changed behavior, with contributions to preventing similar harm, with the hard work of becoming someone who would never make those choices again. As the symposium concluded, Ophelia looked out at the audience of judges, attorneys, law enforcement officials, and advocates who had spent 3 hours engaged with ideas about justice, redemption, and the complex relationship between crime and healing. This was what she had dreamed of as a child, reading about landmark cases by flashlight, not just practicing law, but contributing to the evolution of legal thinking about fundamental questions of human behavior and institutional response. But more than that, she felt something she hadn't experienced since before her father's illness: wholeness. Not the wholeness that came from avoiding harm or protecting herself from betrayal, but the wholeness that came from transforming damage into wisdom, trauma into expertise, and personal pain into public service. As people began filing out of the conference room, Vivian approached her sister. "Ophelia, thank you for making this possible. I know it was a risk giving me this opportunity to contribute something meaningful instead of just being an example of criminal behavior."
"Thank you for doing the work to earn it," Ophelia replied. "3 years ago, I thought justice meant seeing you punished. Today I learned that justice might mean something more complicated, seeing both of us transformed by what happened in ways that help other families avoid similar tragedies." They walked out of the Hart Senate office building together, twin sisters who had found each other again through the hardest possible path. The afternoon sun was warm on their faces as they stepped onto the street, and for the first time in years, the future felt full of possibilities that belonged to both of them, legitimately earned and authentically lived. This is the remarkable true story of Ophelia Chen, whose life was shattered when she discovered that her own twin sister had systematically stolen her identity, and how that devastating betrayal ultimately transformed both their lives and changed how America addresses identity crime. It began with a 3:47 a.m. phone call from Justice Morrison of the Supreme Court. Ophelia was working as a paralegal in Queens, barely making ends meet, when she received the call that would expose a truth more devastating than any nightmare. Her twin sister, Vivian, had been working as Justice Morrison's law clerk, using Ophelia's stolen academic credentials. For months, Vivian had been living Ophelia's dream life. She had secured the prestigious Supreme Court clerkship that Ophelia had earned through years of academic excellence, funded an elaborate wedding with credit cards opened in Ophelia's name, and built a successful career on achievements that belonged to her sister. Meanwhile, Ophelia watched her credit score plummet and her professional prospects evaporate, never suspecting that her own family member was the architect of her destruction. The discovery was earth-shattering. Justice Morrison had noticed inconsistencies in the law clerk's background and launched an investigation that revealed the elaborate fraud. Ophelia learned that while she had been struggling to survive on paralegal wages, her sister had been earning a 6-figure salary, living in a luxury apartment, and planning a future built entirely on stolen achievements. What followed was a complex federal prosecution that tore the Chen family apart. Vivian was charged with multiple felonies: identity theft, fraud, forgery, and perjury. The case attracted national media attention as one of the most sophisticated family fraud schemes ever prosecuted, involving forged transcripts, stolen Social Security numbers, and years of systematic deception. The legal process was traumatic for both sisters. Ophelia had to testify against her own twin, detailing the financial and emotional devastation she had suffered.
Vivian had faced federal prison time and the complete destruction of the life she had built on lies. Their family relationships were shattered as parents struggled to understand how one daughter could systematically steal from another. Vivian ultimately pleaded guilty and served 14 months in federal prison, but the legal resolution did nothing to heal the psychological wounds or repair the damaged family relationships. The most unexpected part of the story began after the criminal case ended. Both sisters entered intensive therapy to address the complex psychological dynamics that had enabled such devastating betrayal within a family. They worked with Dr. Martinez, a specialist in family fraud psychology, to understand how sibling rivalry, parental expectations, and competitive dynamics had created an environment where identity theft seemed like a solution rather than a crime. The therapeutic process was more difficult than prison had been. It required both sisters to confront uncomfortable truths about their family dynamics, their individual choices, and their capacity for both harm and healing. Ophelia had to work through her trauma as a victim while also examining how family competition might have contributed to the crisis. Vivian had to take full responsibility for her choices while developing the emotional skills to ensure she would never make similar decisions again.
Slowly, painfully, they began to rebuild their relationship on a foundation of complete honesty about their failures and limitations. They learned to love each other while fully acknowledging the worst things they were capable of doing. Their new relationship was different from their original sisterhood, less naive but more authentic, less trusting but more resilient. The identity theft experience launched Ophelia into a legal career she never could have imagined. She completed law school while working to rebuild her credit and professional reputation, specializing in identity crime law. Her personal experience gave her unique insights into the legal, financial, and psychological dimensions of identity theft that traditional legal training couldn't provide. She became a federal prosecutor specializing in identity crimes, then was appointed to direct the Federal Task Force on Identity Crime Prevention. Her work caught the attention of the White House because she understood identity theft not just as a legal problem, but as a human experience that affected families, relationships, and individual psychology in profound ways. Vivian's path was equally unexpected. After prison and therapy, she completed law school and earned a doctorate in counseling psychology, specializing in family fraud prevention. Her unique perspective as someone who had committed these crimes gave her insights into the psychological factors that contributed to identity theft, knowledge that proved invaluable for developing prevention and intervention programs. Together, the sisters developed groundbreaking approaches to family fraud that challenged traditional assumptions about crime and punishment. They created therapeutic intervention protocols that addressed identity theft as a symptom of deeper psychological and family issues, rather than simply a criminal act deserving punishment. Their work led to the establishment of specialized identity crime courts that combined traditional legal processes with restorative justice approaches. These courts recognized that family fraud cases often involved complex psychological dynamics that required therapeutic intervention rather than purely punitive responses. The pilot programs they developed showed remarkable success. 80% of families who completed restorative justice processes reported improved relationships. Recidivism rates were less than 5%, and victim satisfaction was significantly higher than in traditional criminal courts. Ophelia's career trajectory took her from victim to prosecutor to federal judge to national policy leader. She was appointed to chair the Commission on Digital Identity Protection with authority to develop comprehensive national policy recommendations for preventing identity crime in the digital age. Their therapeutic intervention protocols became standard practice in family therapy programs across the country. The specialized court model was replicated in multiple federal districts. Their joint research influenced legal scholarship and policy development, changing how the American legal system understood and responded to identity crime. This story reveals something profound about the nature of justice, healing, and human transformation. 10 years after that devastating phone call,
Both sisters had built meaningful careers from their shared trauma. Ophelia had learned that her real identity couldn't be stolen because it was built on values, relationships, and character rather than external achievements. Vivian had discovered that accountability through healing could be more meaningful than punishment through imprisonment. Their professional collaboration became a model for how victim and perpetrator could work together to prevent similar tragedies for other families. They demonstrated that justice could serve both accountability and healing, that the worst betrayal could become the foundation for authentic trust, and that personal trauma could be transformed into public service.
Today, millions of families benefit from the identity crime prevention programs, therapeutic intervention protocols, and specialized court processes that grew out of one family's journey from betrayal to healing. The Chen sisters' story proves that individual experience, no matter how painful, can contribute to collective wisdom and systemic change. Their work continues to influence how America addresses identity crime, moving beyond purely punitive approaches toward comprehensive responses that serve both justice and healing. They showed that the most meaningful work often happens at the intersection of personal experience and public service, individual healing and collective transformation. If this story of resilience, redemption, and the transformation of personal trauma into public good resonated with you, please subscribe to hear more remarkable true stories of human triumph over adversity. Your subscription helps us continue sharing these powerful narratives of how individual courage can create lasting change in the world.